Yeah, not every radio show gets a disclaimer like that, but I do. My name is Malcolm Byrne. You're listening to The Long Way Round here on Radio Kingston. Before I begin the show, I would like to say that this program strongly opposes violence in any and all its forms, and is neither pro nor anti-Russia, Ukraine, China, or even the United States for that matter. It is pro-peace, which I think is a far more productive position to take. War is, as author and journalist Chris Hedges put it, the greatest evil. Most of us know war only superficially through Hollywood's fictional glorifications and drama. One only need think of the heroic but tragic life of decorated Navy SEAL Chris Kyle, seen through the lens of a long-range sniper's rifle in Clint Eastwood's Academy Award-nominated film American Sniper, or through the eyes of a handheld camera filming the lifelike recreation of the Normandy landings on D-Day in 1944 during the opening scenes of the Spielberg film Saving Private Ryan, to understand my point that although war can be expertly and even empathetically seen and heard through the vision of the filmmaker, in the end rarely, if ever, does a film about war rise above the level of voyeuristic spectacle verging on pornography. Once these iconic images of war have been constructed in the public's mind, it's very difficult to erase them. Even bona fide anti-war films, such as German war veteran Erich Maria Remarque's World War I epic All Quiet on the Western Front, or Stanley Kubrick's war psychosis-inducing treatise on the human descent into barbarity, Full Metal Jacket, ultimately fail in their aim to deglorify war, due to the truth that the horror of war can never be fully expressed through film. War drags us inexorably into its hurricane crossfire of divisiveness and perversion. Thus, in the end, war becomes simply spectacle. Here I quote from an article published on the film buff site movielocations.com regarding the locations for Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan. For the actual landings in 1944, the stretch of Normandy coast had been divided into 5 sectors code-named Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Omaha Beach is now a historical landmark, and the surrounding area has been substantially redeveloped. The nearest match to stage the harrowing landing scenes were found on the southeast coast of the Republic of Ireland, on Balliniscar Beach, Curracloe, just north of Wexford, about 70 miles south of Dublin by rail. Machine gun positions and the massive X-shaped metal structures dropped to prevent just such a landing were built there, at a cost of more than $12 million, and over 11 weeks, 1,500 people, tons of explosives, and thousands of gallons of fake blood transformed a kilometer of the Irish beach into the bloody battlefield. And to this day, one can still go to Balliniscar Beach, Wexford, Ireland, to sit on the exact spot where Steven Spielberg planted his cinematic butt in the sand to soak up some of that famed Spielberg magic. Does anyone actually know or care whether Tom Hanks, the current poster child for the U.S. military-industrial complex, was actually at one time or another in the military? And does it even matter? No one questioned John Wayne's patriotic portrayal of gung-ho Captain Mike Kirby in the pro-war recruitment film The Green Berets, released at the height of the Tet Offensive in 1968, before the Vietnam War took off in earnest towards its disastrous conclusion. It was only after being shot through the spine with a VC bullet that my friend and anti-war activist Bobby Mueller, a 3-time tour-of-duty Marine veteran, questioned his own enthusiasm for killing, tragically ending up for the rest of his life in a wheelchair in the process. We see such films as forms of redemption, but rarely, if ever, do we see the aftermath of war. And it is only years after events that the true tragedy, horror, and injustice of any given war is revealed. And even then, typically without consequence to the very people that led us blindly from one imperialist disaster to another. Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq, Syria, and the list goes on. Rarely do we hear of the lies and deceptions that lead us to war. All is forgotten amongst the endless media-driven clamor for the next war, the good war, the just war. In reality, war is much crueler and completely devoid of any virtue whatsoever, except to the war profiteers and politicians who use war cynically as a means to an end. I recall my own revelations when visiting Sarajevo, several months after the brutal civil war officially ended there. It was indeed an eye-opening moment to see that the real war was about power, corruption, and control of resources, both material and human. As highly decorated World War I veteran U.S. Major General Smedley Darlington Butler wrote in his instructional yet sadly mostly forgotten 1935 book, War is Indeed a Racket, generally perpetrated by gangsters and psychopaths. The world's most revered yet currently unemployed journalist Seymour Hersh recently revealed that Russia is now selling diesel fuel to Ukraine so that Ukraine can continue prosecuting a U.S.-led proxy war funded by American tax dollars to in turn fight a defensive war against Russia. You can't make this stuff up. And if you do think about it too much, your head will just explode. The levels of corruption are only measured by the levels of investment and return on these cynical wars for profit. It is truly a house of mirrors, smoke and mirrors to be more precise. One could argue the point that this current war with Russia is really driven by America's primary aim, which is to retain global economic and military hegemony over the world, but perhaps that's a conversation for another time. The propaganda machine is now so powerful that it's extremely difficult to even have these conversations without being labeled a Putin apologist, a right-wing conspiratorial nut job, or even worse, simply a traitor. This was the fate 100 years ago of renowned American pacifist and anarchist Emma Goldman, who was ultimately jailed and eventually deported for her heroic anti-war activities during World War I. I was attracted to my guest tonight, Diane Sare, for her outspokenness and condemnation of war, as well as her passion for humanity as expressed through music. Diane Sare is currently running as the Larouche Candidate for US Senate. I spoke to Diane earlier this week from her home in Rockland County, New York. Tonight she shares some of her clear-headed and informed opinions and views with us now. Welcome, Diane. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be able to have you on the show. I've been following you for a little while now, actually, since your last run for, was it for Senate last? You ran against Chuck Schumer, correct?
Yes, exactly.
And how did that go? Was that a tough slog, or? I mean, I'm sort of understating.
Well, yeah, I mean, what you mean by tough. I had a good time. The worst part about it was the ballot access, because for independent candidates, they tripled the signature requirement. And the 15,000 signatures statewide in 6 weeks was already onerous.
Mm-hmm.
45,000 was clearly designed to be impossible. And it's not like other states, some states have very large signature requirements, but you have a lot longer to get them. In New York, it's very strict. There's a starting date and ending date, 6 weeks, and they didn't extend the time. And it was also just coming off of the COVID lockdown, so you didn't have the traffic flow in a lot of places. And I was the only person in the entire state that was able to make that requirement. We turned in 66,000 signatures, but it was very brutal.
Yeah. Well, what I mean by tough slog is, I encountered the rather pretty closed New York electoral system back in 2016 during the primaries when Bernie Sanders was running. The fact that you have to register as whatever it is you're going to register as, Republican, Democrat, Independent, Green Party, or whatever, that has to be done 6 months before you can vote in the primaries. And that was very difficult raising signatures, especially when I was on campus, for example, up in Albany. And a lot of first-year students are like, yeah, I really want to vote for Bernie Sanders. And I'd say, well, have you registered as a Democrat? Oh, I didn't know I even needed to do that. Well, yes, and you had to do that 6 months ago. So, of course, that's what I mean by tough. So
yes.
I congratulate you for your achievement.
Well, it's designed to be exclusive. I guess they're afraid that they can't quite control us enough through censorship, so they also have to control who our choices are at the ballot. And of course, the censorship has also become much more extreme.
Mm-hmm. And who are you up against? Is it Kristen
Gillibrand.
Gillibrand is your opponent? So, yeah, I'd heard you talking about her. There's something she wants to pass.
The Restrict Act,
Right.
which I think may be dead in the water because it was so extreme. But the point about it is it gives you an insight into the mindset. This was an act to penalize companies or individuals that could be accused of um, sharing technology with evil nations, and they had a list: Russia, China, Cuba, North Korea, Iran, and Venezuela. I think that's the list. Or if one of these companies produces, say, a Chinese webcam, which is an over 1 million items sold in the US, then apparently they can just seize them all because they say this is China trying to influence the United States or the minds of Americans. It's really bizarre. And you can face up to 20 years in prison, $250,000 to $1 million fine. And the last paragraph of the bill says the Freedom of Information Act does not apply. So if they determine that you're responsible for leaking classified information, since it's classified, you never get to know what you're accused of.
It sounds truly Orwellian,
Yes.
doesn't it?
Yes, it really does. And that should give people an insight into the mindset. So I think Kirsten knows. She just started this newsletter. I don't know if it's because of my candidacy or she expects to have a primary challenger or a Republican, where she's putting out once a week these really little puff pieces where it's 5 photographs of her handing out cookies at a nursing home,
Oh, Lord.
getting somebody their tax return. And what she's involved in is actually the height of the military industrial complex. Her family is British Aerospace. Her father-in-law was briefly, I think, the vice president or something, vice director of British Aerospace. She made sure they got a big plant in Binghamton. It's very bad news.
Isn't FOIA sort of the last vestige of the First Amendment, in a sense?
Yes.
I mean,
One would think. I mean, once, and I saw this, I found it very revealing. I think it was either in the Financial Times or the London Economist, where they were talking about Nigeria. And they were talking about basically their plans to overthrow the government. And they said that even the most stable nations can be overthrown if the bond of trust between the people and the government is destroyed. So think about that.
it's so. I've been having some great difficulty these days because with this sort of demise of mainstream media as something that once, I don't know about you, but I suppose I have this sort of naive rose-colored glasses view of the media back in the days when I was younger. The Walter Cronkites and these sort of people that you felt. I can't say this for absolute sure, but I felt that people like that and the journalism that they were doing under Edward Murrow and so forth was fairly impartial and non-biased and non-partisan, whereas I feel like everything, like across the board, and I'm not just talking about mainstream media like the CNN, Fox News, MSNBC sort of echo chambers, but even on the internet it's very difficult because it does feel like almost everybody has some sort of an agenda. So it feels as if we're all living in kind of a house of mirrors almost, where you just don't know who to believe. And what you just said really re-emphasizes almost like a psyops sort of approach to undermining voters' confidence in the system. And I always thought that was kind of a side effect, not an actual intended result.
Right. Yeah, that's why
say.
it was so jarring when I saw that, because I said, oh my gosh, they know exactly what they're doing and to what end. And here we are now. I mean, we are closer to thermonuclear war than I ever imagined we would be. And Lyndon LaRouche, my mentor, would warn about this all the time, going back to Jimmy Carter, when Carter brought in Zbigniew Brzezinski, right? The
I know that
chessboard.
name,
And that's what we're seeing right now. They want to break up Russia into 40 different pieces. And then they say Putin is paranoid and he's just, oh no, we're not trying. Biden gives speeches saying Putin should be overthrown. When he was in Poland, he said that outright. And now you have this assassination attempt, which they thwarted happily. But we're going into VE Day. Tuesday is May 9th. Victory in Europe, the defeat of Hitler. Americans used to be happy about defeating Hitler. Now, not so much.
I wanted to almost play a bit sort of the devil's advocate, going back to something you just said. I guess what I wanted to go back to was just, you had said that this assassination attempt on Vladimir Putin, the two drones that hit the Kremlin. I don't know if you're familiar with well, there's a number of journalists out there that have sort of undermined that idea that it was in fact more of a false flag operation, because they're just these little drones and they hit the top of the dome of the Kremlin and they kind of hit near the flag and it's very symbolic. What would you respond to that kind of pushback?
Well, I would say, one, we have a president who's called for Putin to be overthrown. We actually have members of Congress, and I can't remember which one it was, if it was Lindsey Graham or some other lunatic, who said that it would be good for someone to take Putin out, which I think is highly irresponsible for any elected official to be saying about a head of state of a nuclear power, whether you think you agree with them or not. But we had Biden saying on February 7th of last year, 2022, that if Russia invaded Ukraine, the Nord Stream pipelines would stop. And then the journalist said, well, how would that be? And he said, well, take my word for it. It'll be over. And then they turned to Olaf Scholz, who really should have been run out of town on a rail, at least if I were in Germany, and there were a lot of people who thought like me, because they said to him, well, Chancellor, what do you think of this? And he said, oh, we do everything with the United States. What is that?
Yeah.
So then, lo and behold, the pipeline gets blown up. And then we're told, oh, yeah, Russia did it. Now, Russia can turn off the gas on and off anytime they want. They have no reason to blow up something that cost $11 billion to build, but we were supposed to believe that Russia did it. And when that became even too much for very gullible people to stomach, then they came up with another story about a bunch of people on a sailboat.
Gilligan, the skipper and Gilligan and Marianne and the professor on a 3-hour tour. Yeah, the SS Winner. Yeah.
So I would say, when you have people in the West proposing that Putin be eliminated, talking about a decapitation strike, a disarming strike, then there's only one way that the Russians are going to perceive what happened. And that's what you have to be conscious of. They have no need to do false flags against themselves. They know that they're at war. They've lost at least tens of thousands of people, not nearly the number of Ukrainians who have been killed. And that you can know just from knowing the figures on shells. I think Ukraine is expending 6,000 to 8,000 shells per day. Russia is 40,000.
Mm-hmm.
Know that the amount of damage they're inflicting is going to be at least 5 times greater. But people are aware that they're at war, and so therefore it just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And I'm really very concerned that no leadership in the U.S. has forcefully condemned this. And the Russians have said outright that they think Ukraine does not do anything on its own without permission from Washington. I would say permission from London, really, as the orchestrator of this. You remember when the thing almost ended last April, and Boris Johnson, who has such an enormous ego, I think he had to fly in a jumbo jet, but to land in Kiev.
And it was to fit his hair.
Yeah, right, exactly. To stop this. And then, Zelensky had a 90-minute conversation with Xi Jinping. China has a great deal to offer. Nations that work with China get new ports, modern rail. He could have real hope of reconstruction of Ukraine. So he has a 90-minute phone call with Xi Jinping. And the next thing you know, Sir Richard Dearlove, former head of the MI6, in these intelligence agencies, there's no such thing as former, but former head of the MI6 is over there. And then the spokesman for Zelensky, Podolyak, I think his name is, comes out and says, oh, no, we couldn't work with China until they distance themselves from Russia.
There's an incredible amount of undermining of any possibility of a peace process. That's a real change. I mean, it's always the United States that was kind of, ironically, trying to negotiate for peace. But we're just not getting that, and what really shocks me is the sort of broad consensus for continued conflict from the West. And Americans, I think, don't really feel the reality of that because we're not seeing our boys and girls coming home in body bags. So it's kind of all over there. But regardless, it's a proxy war. It's still a war. And sanctions are a form of warfare, too, I'm sure you would agree. So,
yes.
There's like 1,000-something sanctions going on right now with Russia. I want to talk a little bit because, well, first of all, I don't want to overlook the fact that you're a musician. So we have a lot in common, and that's part of the nature of this show is to incorporate music. So why don't we go to the first piece of music?
Okay.
And you can, before we play that music, give me a little, just a bit of a preamble as to why that, and then we'll get back into the politics.
Okay, sure. And just to dangari-ko-do-ko-do-dangari-ko, it's a Japanese children's song. And I put that first because it actually, I think, was the first song I ever remember learning. I was 3 years old, and my family is Quaker, but my father was drafted to go to Vietnam. And he got a slight deferment because my sister was being born. This was 1968. So at any rate, he left after her birth, so it must have been probably October of 68. And he sent back these Japanese records, 2 albums of Japanese children's songs. And I listened to them all the time. And I think that was somewhat, so I was very conscious as a 3-year-old that he wasn't there, that he was sending back Japanese songs. And my mother tells me I used to go up to strange men on the street and hug them.
Are you my daddy?
Yeah,
Have you seen my dad?
Right.
He's a big guy.
Yeah, exactly. I really, it was a tough time. I just also remember making little Play-Doh things to send him over there. Yeah, and you'll see it comes up later if we go to the next song, if you don't mind my saying, because they're sort of a pair, which is...
yeah, maybe I'll play them both back to back.
Okay, fine. Yeah, George Fox. Right. There's a light that was shining when the world began. There's a light that is shining in the heart of a man. There's light that is shining in the Turk and the Jew. There's a light that is shining, friend, in me and in you, which is a Quaker song. My mother went to Swarthmore College. She wasn't from a Quaker background, but Swarthmore, of course, is a Quaker school. She met my father at Brown University, another Quaker school. And so from an early age, I was attending Friends meeting. We moved to Albuquerque because we lived on Sandia Base for a while, and then we moved elsewhere while my father was in Vietnam, and then he came back and finished his residency there. And I became really conscious of the war because my mother was visiting widows. And I remember now I was 4 or 5 years old. Every time I had a wish, when you blow out the the dandelion, blow the seeds off the dandelion. I always wished that the war would end. So, I had not thought how much of an impact this had, but also the George Fox song about the certain divine spark in everybody equally. And the meeting that I was part of did not do, at least I wasn't involved in any demonstrations or things like that, but I remember preparing food to send to people who were starving in Africa and things like that as a child. The irony is my father was in the civil rights movement. He was the treasurer for SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee at Brown University, sponsored Martin Luther King speaking there, went to lunch counter sit-ins and bus rides. I didn't know any of this about my father until 10 years after I was married and out of the house.
Wow. So
Right.
Anyway, we'll go to this bit of music and we'll come back with Diane Sare.
どんぐりころころどんぶりこお池にはまってさ大変土壌が出てきてこんにちは坊ちゃん一緒に遊びましょうどんぐりころころ喜んでしばらく一緒に遊んだがやっぱりお山が恋しいと泣いては土壌を困らせたどんぐりころころどんぶりこお池にはまってさ大変土壌が出てきてこんにちは坊ちゃん一緒に遊びましょうどんぐりころころ喜んでしばらく一緒に遊んだがやっぱりお山が恋しいと泣いては土壌を困らせた動画を見
Diane, I wanted to ask you about Lyndon Larouche, because clearly that has been you're called a Larouche candidate. So I'd like to ask you why you define yourself as a Larouche candidate, and also talk a little bit about Lyndon and also his philosophy regarding economics and politics and so forth.
Great. Well, I'm happy to do that and glad that you asked. LaRouche also comes from a New England Quaker background.
What's with these Quakers?
I know. And very similar also with ancestors on the Mayflower, but we're not related. We didn't have the same ancestors. I mean, everyone, I think we're all related if you go back far enough. But
yeah.
At any rate, well, when I was a student at New England Conservatory, I ran into organizers with LaRouche, and he was actually on trial there. They were already trying to silence him. And the fact that he was about to be put in jail was something that I found of great interest given my own background and having read John Woolman's journal, and because the Quakers were in jail a lot for opposing slavery and various things. So I saw that as a plus, not a minus, which apparently was rather unusual because there weren't a lot of people joining the campaign while he was on trial, as you might imagine. And I attended a conference which was, in effect, to revive the legacy of the Bretton Woods system. And he was speaking about evil. He actually used the word evil.
The Bretton Woods, just for people who are not familiar, was an economic agreement that took place in, what was it, 1948?
44.
44. And just the basic nature of that was?
Just before the war ended, the idea, what FDR's intent was, and unfortunately Keynes got his way on a lot of things, so there were a lot of flaws with it, but the idea was fixed exchange rates. At the time, the dollar was pegged to gold, and the intent was to sort of level the playing field so that you would make it possible for nations to have access to long-term credit. And when they repaid the loans, they wouldn't owe 50 times what they borrowed because their currency was devalued or this sort of thing. So it was a kind of agreement among nations. Now, in retrospect, you could see that African nations were not well represented there. So it wasn't perfect, but it was certainly far better than what we have today. And FDR's intent, which got him into a lot of very contentious arguments with Churchill, was that at the end of the war, every single colony should get its independence. And FDR was very explicit with Churchill. He said, we're not in this war against the Nazis, against fascism, to allow 18th century methods to continue around the world. And Churchill said, what do you mean 18th century methods? And FDR said, whatever that extracts the labor and goods from a nation and gives them nothing in return. Mm-hmm. And this conversation was recounted by FDR's son, Elliot Roosevelt, in a book that he wrote. Actually, it was in 1946. Elliot Roosevelt, I believe, was in the Air Force and was able to accompany his father on a lot of meetings during the war. And he was so distraught because after FDR's death, and the British made sure the war was prolonged enough that FDR would not be there when the war ended. So you had Truman, a total Anglophile, drop the nuclear bombs on Japan completely unnecessarily. And what Elliot Roosevelt said is virtually all the promises my father made to China, to Russia, were violated. And nations didn't get their independence. And he stressed, as FDR had stressed, that if you don't eradicate poverty, if you don't allow and encourage every nation to develop and to develop its population, then you are sowing the seeds for future wars. And I think this affected Larouche a lot. He was a World War II veteran, also not in combat, but medic. He was doing training of soldiers, and then he was a medic in Burma, and then he was in India as the war ended. He was actually there right after the horrible massacre in Calcutta in 1946, which also had a huge effect on him. Mm-hmm. So I think he, in a sense, saw as his life's mission at the time, maybe not knowing all the details, that it very much was resonant with what FDR intended, but that it was for the United States to ensure that every nation had their freedom, which included economic independence. He used to talk about a full set economy. What does that mean? A machine tool capability, food self-sufficiency, that every nation, in effect, had to have the capacity to be self-sufficient, and that it was in our interest for that to occur because that's how you get stability.
Mm-hmm. So how do you see that playing into your campaign and also into the current, in a perfect world, if would you see these ideas reincorporated into the American political sphere in terms of our foreign policy and so forth?
Yeah, One thing I'm thinking of doing is actually a lot of work on American history, because there's been such an operation to make young people hate our country. That the line, we were based on slavery, it was all a bunch of white slave owners who yeah, there were some slave owners. Washington had slaves, although he liberated them all, and I think ultimately was opposed to it. Thomas Jefferson was a problem. He was the real mixed bag, and he never saw the light, so to speak. But if you take Hamilton, Ben Franklin, John Jay, Gouverneur Morris, they were all strong abolitionists, if you want to put it that way, strongly anti-slavery. They knew it was not coherent with the intent of the nation. And we were the first successful revolution against the British Empire. And it was hugely important. If you read the writings of John Quincy Adams about what our relations with other nations should be, or you look at what happened after the misnamed Civil War, what were we doing? We had people working in Egypt to build the Suez Canal. But not only that, Alexandria built a huge opera house. Egypt had in mind that they were really going to be, in a sense, part of European culture. And you had George Washington Whistler, I think that was his name, who went to Russia to build the Trans-Siberian Railroad. He died there. So actually, our nation was sort of a generator of good ideas. And the brightest minds in the United States were in dialogue with people like Mendeleev, who wrote the periodic table, but who came to Philadelphia for the Centennial Exhibition. We had very close relations, actually, with China. Sun Yat-sen modeled himself very much on Abraham Lincoln. So if we were acting in our true identity, we would never see China's emergence from poverty and backwardness as a threat or something to be attacked. We would appreciate the differences. They're coming from a totally different perspective than we are. Ben Franklin studied Confucius. He used to print the Analects of Confucius in his newspaper. But all this history is lost. So young people today, in a sense, have no mooring. They don't know what it really means to be an American. They've been told if you're an American, you're really a horrible person from the British Empire. You're racist, you support slavery, and you want to put your foot on everybody's head. So no wonder they're suicidal and homicidal. And, I think having a sense of identity and history is very important. And we can choose what part of our history we want to identify with. So if you want to be an evil person, you can identify with the evil and bad things. But if you want to be good and you want mankind to prosper, then you can look for that thread, which is actually very strong. How else could we have produced so many brilliant people? I mean, Abraham Lincoln, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King. We produced a lot of Eleanor Roosevelt, brilliant people, American political culture. There was something very good to it, and I'm very interested in reviving that.
Well, I know there's those well-used catchphrases, those who forget their history are doomed to repeat it, or as Mark Twain once said, history rarely repeats, but it often rhymes. Dan, I wanted to ask you to preamble the next piece on our musical playlist.
Sure. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, in this case conducted by Wilhelm Furtwängler.
And you say this is, or the comments underneath this piece on YouTube are, this is by far the best rendition of the piece that's ever been recorded. So.
Well, Furtwängler was a great favorite of Larouche, and if you read his writings, and he was slandered because he didn't leave Germany, because he felt loyal to the people, and he was trying, I think, really to fight fascism with his music. He also helped many Jews to escape, and then finally someone got word to him that he was next on the chopping block, so he finally fled. And then he was slandered as being a Nazi, which he absolutely was not. He had an idea of music, he said, between the notes. And I think this is why Larouche really liked him, because he said it's not in the sound. It's in what's not heard, which the sound creates. In a sense, a poem, right? This principle of metaphor, it's actually not in the words. The words serve to kind of incite an idea in your own mind.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an active thing, right? Reading a poem is an active thing because it's your own mind that's it's not literal. And so he had this incredible understanding of the music, which led to this amazing tension at the beginning and the end and throughout. People also complain about his slow tempi, but sometimes he's much faster than they are. And I'll never forget, I was watching a documentary about Furtwängler, and they interviewed someone who'd played in the orchestra under him, and it was a timpanist. And the guy said, well, I was a timpanist and I was studying to be a conductor, so I always had my head buried in the score. And there was a rehearsal going on, not conducted by Furtwängler, but it was his orchestra. So I had my head in the score, and suddenly I noticed the entire orchestra was playing differently, and the violins were full and rich with vibrato. And I thought, my goodness, did 10 new musicians just show up and sit down? What happened? And then I looked up, and in the back of the room, Wilhelm Furtwängler had entered. And just his presence changed the entire way that everybody was playing.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you hear this, this was the theme, as you know, of the Berlin Wall coming down. And so I had been a political organizer then with Larouche's campaign for just a couple of years. He had been, he had been sentenced to prison in January of 89, 15 years.
What was he sentenced for? I'm sorry.
Conspiracy to confuse and obstruct the IRS and mail fraud. Those were the official charges. And it was a total rocket back in court. The case is very involved, but I'll just say the mail fraud charge involved his writing to a supporter. The government had seized all our publications and declared our companies involuntarily bankrupt, making it illegal for the companies to repay loans because the government had seized all the accounts. So Larouche wrote a letter to a contributor saying, thank you so much for your support. We do intend to repay you, but we're having these difficulties. And since the court ruled that we didn't intend to repay loans, that was considered fraud. I mean, the trial was amazing. The judge ruled that the involuntary bankruptcy began after the decision. Anyway, the involuntary bankruptcy was not allowed to be presented as evidence for the non-payment of loans. So
very
that's
Kafkaesque.
Yeah, it was really outrageous. At any rate, so you had Tiananmen Square, and then you had all these nations getting their freedom from the Soviet Union. And Larouche had actually proposed that the Berlin Wall come down, that the Soviets would agree that the West would feed Poland in return for the reunification of Germany. He said that in 1988, October of 88. And I was just getting active with the campaign, and I thought, what an odd thing. Here's an American presidential candidate running over to Berlin calling for the reunification of Germany. And his wife, who was German, said she also thought that was an amazing idea, but was not likely to happen. Well, he gets sent to jail, and the next thing you know, the Berlin Wall is coming down. So I started listening to the symphony over and over and over again, and that's why it's there. It became a part of my daily routine.
Well, here's the fourth movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. I'm going to fade this out because I want to make sure that we have enough time to hear the whole interview with Diane Sare. That was an excerpt from Beethoven's Symphony No. 9. It was the part of the fourth movement, the most recognizable part of the fourth movement, conducted by the great German composer Wilhelm Furtwängler. That was recorded in 1943. Not quite sure what orchestra it was, but anyway, you can hear the scratches on that record. So we're back with our interview with Diane. Diane. I'm your host, Malcolm Byrne. My guest on the show tonight is Diane Sare, who is running as an independent candidate for US Senate. Diane, thank you so much for that suggestion of music. It's so... I remember reading somewhere, I'm very interested in Beethoven's artistic process, and I remember reading somewhere in a biography or something where the one of the servants in Beethoven's household had commented to one of the other, I think the maestro has finally lost it when he was composing the piece, because he was just sort of, they said, well, he's just going around the house singing children's nursery rhymes. He's really gone, he's lost it, his dementia's set in. But I think the intention of that piece was, he was a product of his times, of course, of the Renaissance, the three great revolutions, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution. And he believed in the common, well, I'm going to say common man, common person. And he wanted to write a hit, like something that everybody could sing, in order to sort of create something universal. And he sure did it. What an immense achievement. The next piece
of Schiller, I have to say, Friedrich Schiller, the incredible poet of freedom of Germany. And there are some people who say that the spark, right, Daughter of Elysium, the spark was Beethoven's gesture toward Ben Franklin and his work on electricity.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's incredible. Gosh. It's, you're absolutely right. Like, history is so instructive and fascinating, and I guess we do tend to sort of look at current events in a bit of a vacuum. And
yes.
and I think the powers that be understand that the public's memory is very short. People can do certain things and get away with it, and 6 months later everyone's completely forgotten because they've been brainwashed, whitewashed with some other new outrage, and it just goes on and on and on. But when you look at things in these little snippets of history and go, wow, that really kind of changes your view on things. I have another question for you. I'd like to ask you directly why your connection to music and why it's so important to you, and I think it's important to your candidacy as well.
Yeah. I think so. I don't know. It's just always been a part of my life. My mother sang to me from infancy, and I think it's a really important part of the human identity, and now urgently needed, because people have lost touch with their humanity. They're really, what I think is the horrible crime of AI and thinking they're going to replace human beings with it, is that humans are trying to imitate robots.
Well, you see that with the way people do a lot of, especially you see with younger teenage people, and they're trying. It almost looks like they're trying to look like a robot,
right?
Like a Pixar image or something.
And think like a robot. You're not allowed to have an independent thought. And the arrogance of these social media companies thinking they can control us with algorithms is really an outrage. And if we're not conscious and fighting it, we do get controlled. We do get behavior modified. So the music allows us to get free of that because, again, it's in the domain of the invisible in a sense. And I think this idea that it's not really in the sounds, it's in the mind, because two arbitrary intervals, two noises, if they don't come through the mind of a human being, don't mean anything. But in the mind, then a whole life is created. So I think it's very urgent to give us our identity, to give us our independence, to give us our freedom from the attempt of total thought control that we're experiencing right now.
Speaking of AI, I was just, I attended because I'm a SAG-AFTRA member, and I was down in Greenpoint yesterday for one of the WJ Writers Guild of America protests outside of one of the film company stages. And I just went down there to show my support and hold a sign and so forth. But one of the issues that has come up with the writers is the kind of encroachment of artificial intelligence in writing of the entertain. I mean,
Goodness. Yeah, I thought of that. How awful.
Yeah, it's well, I mean, there's a little bit of that goes on with songwriting too these days, where people use programs to sort of, you come up with one line and the computer will just give you like three other lines and one of them will rhyme, and that's your second verse. I mean, I suppose it could be interesting in a Brian Eno sort of, maybe if you programmed something random in there and came up with something interesting, but the idea that that's going to somehow be a substitute for, because I just don't think there's a program that can replicate intuition, for one thing.
Absolutely. I'm so glad to hear you say that. Thank you.
Well, that's what makes us human, I think, in so many ways. It's part of. I want to ask you. You mentioned, we're going to go back to the unfortunate circumstances in Ukraine, and you said you were moved. I was moved by your comment of you saying you have empathy for the soldiers who are caught in a situation essentially not of their own making. And we're talking about Russians, we're talking about Ukrainians, we're talking about anybody, Syrians, Sandinista. I mean, Vietnamese. I mean, these wars are created, and then we find ourselves just sort of stuck in the middle of this stuff. Perhaps you could just fill in that blank in terms of what you were saying.
Well, I was thinking of the sheer sadism and evil of refusing to allow peace. Because isn't it natural for people to wish to be able to carry on their lives?
Of course.
Not in fear and starvation and bombing and shelling. And that's one of the most hideous situations to put someone into. My heart aches when I think about the soldiers who were ordered to torture people at Abu Ghraib, because it destroys your humanity. And, Frederick Douglass observed this actually when his mistress, who had been teaching him how to read, was rebuked by her husband and ordered, you cannot teach this slave how to read. You have to stop it. And after that point, she became progressively meaner, nastier, more miserable. She became a destroyed person. Frederick Douglass was not destroyed by this, but she was destroyed by it. It's like a satanic cult or ritual. I mean, I won't go there because it's too horrible to think about, but how do you induce people to commit horrible abuses on others? And war, so now we're throwing all these people into this horrible cauldron, and the Ukrainians are just getting ground up. I mean, there are numerous videos now circulating on social media of the Ukrainian army literally grabbing people out of cafes. Anyone who's probably over the age of 14 or 15, any young men, boys, older men are just being thrown into this meat grinder. It's really hideous. And it's horrible for the Russian young men as well, although I would say in their case, there's a certain mission. Denazification is a mission. It's a sacrifice that there's a purpose for.
But what would you say to someone that would push back and say, well, that's just Russian propaganda, and you're being a, quote, Putin apologist, and that's just an excuse for, a re-envisioning of Russian imperialism?
Well, I had my name placed on a kill list. So
the infamous.
I don't think I made it to Mitforets yet, but the Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation had me on their list as an information terrorist who they said should be brought up on war crimes. And this is when I'm running for US Senate in New York. I mean, I wasn't in Ukraine committing war crimes. I was saying we shouldn't be in this war. So what kind of a government makes up lists of people to be eliminated or put on trial for expressing an opinion? That's rather Nazi-like. And then the Mirotvorets list, exactly, where they literally have thousands of journalists, and when they manage to kill one, they put liquidated across their face in red. So you can't say that it's not a kill list.
I know a few people that are actually on that list, including Roger Waters, from former Pink Floyd member.
Yes, exactly. Helga Larouche's widow is on there. Scott Ritter. A lot of people have made it onto that list. And our government seems to be okay with it. But the Azov battalion, I mean, they use the symbols of the Nazis. And many of these people had tattoos with pictures of Adolf Hitler.
It's such a terrible story. It's just, and the fact that most people don't know the background to this is what's really shocking. So,
no, and why would you want to promote that? See, that's the evil. And the British anthropologists or the British foreign officers used to have a policy. They called it bringing out the pig, which meant you dig into someone's culture, you find the worst, most vile aspect of it, and then you promote it, because that's the way you can get people to kill each other. That's the divide and conquer, right? So think about the CIA and all these intelligence agencies saying, oh, well, and they actually kept, as you know, we had the rat line, we kept a lot of the Nazis around. In fact, was it Mykola Lebed who ended up coming to the U.S. and died here? I think a collaborator of Bandera. Was in the United States for many years. So we said, we're going to keep this Nazi legacy alive because we need it to fight the communists. And so, you're keeping this little monster, and then you feed it. You encourage it to grow, you arm it, you expand it. And I think that's really what was done. So you have that evil, hateful ideology, and then you have the funding and fostering of it coming from the various intelligence agencies.
And I want to push back on some of my own detractors who feel that I'm obsessed with this current conflict. I'm not obsessed with this conflict. I just think it brings up a lot of realities regarding war in general that we can see in real time. You can apply all of these things to the invasion of Iraq, the deceptions, outright. I mean, you probably know this better than anyone, but, governments are really good at making up stories. It's just what they do. You could call it lies or stories, but, I think it was Joseph Goebbels said, you want to do it right, you come up with a big lie and then tell it over and over and over and over again. And that's just how you do it, and so. And
then worse, in a way, is Leo Strauss, who says you tell a big lie that everyone knows is a lie, but they don't have the power to resist it, and that's how you terrorize them into submission.
Well, on that cheerful note, I think it might be time for some more music, Diane.
Good, thank God. Let's get back Beethoven.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's a reason for all of this. Yeah, the Beethoven. We're into his seventh symphony, and you had asked me which movement would be appropriate, and I had chosen the second movement.
Yes, and that's fine because that's the Passacaglia, and that kind of persistence is, in a way, what we're doing. That symphony I heard every week, every Friday at noon for many years, from 1993 to about 2002, when I moved to Washington, D.C., and they had there a statue of Albert Pike, who was the founder of and chief judicial officer of the Ku Klux Klan. He's also
I was going to say, where's that name familiar?
Yeah, he was also a top-ranking Scottish Rite Freemason. And they had a monument honoring him in Judiciary Square, of all places. So associates of Larouche decided that we were going to get the statue down. So every week we had a rally where we marched around and had people. One of my friends actually climbed up on Albert Pike and put a hood and robe on him and managed to escape he was a rock climber. He came down, did not get arrested, thank God, got away. But at any rate, so we began a campaign to remove the statue. And we got, I think, the DC City Council. I don't know if we were able to get them to pass a resolution against it or not. So we started going to other councils like Nashville, Tennessee. In Nashville, we had a huge fight in the city council to get a resolution against the Pike statue. The father of the council member who introduced the resolution, who was African American, his father somehow mysteriously got burned alive in his home at the time this resolution was introduced. I remember going also to Memphis, where Pike hailed from, and we were out on the street campaigning, and I got invited to a meeting at the American Legion. I forget if this was Nashville or Memphis. So my husband and I go, we're traveling with another organizer who's African American. He didn't come with us to this meeting. And we sit there and the men start saying, well, y'all know about the Ku Klux Klan. They, when a man was beating his wife, they would come and take care of that situation. So we realized that somehow we were sitting in the middle of a Klan meeting. And I just suddenly, I said, I have another appointment. I really have to leave. So Chris and I got in our car, left, and we didn't go back to our hotel because we didn't want anyone to know that we were traveling with an African, at least we didn't want the Klan to know we were traveling with an African American and put him in danger. So we drove to a shopping mall, had dinner, that I remember very vividly. At any rate, and we had actually the Sons of the Confederate Veterans come to the Nashville City Council. I'd love to dig up this video. Me being a Quaker from Maine, I thought everyone in New England should take a tour of the South and see how alive the Confederacy is in the minds of some people. So this guy from the Sons of the Confederate Veterans came and told us that the Ku Klux Klan only committed crimes when it was Black people wearing the white sheets. Yeah. That's who were the terrorists. It wasn't the white members of the Klan. If you can, I mean, it was so surreal.
Wow. Nutty.
So the Beethoven Seventh was our music every week. Now, in the rage against monuments, this statue was torn down, and I don't think we should take our statues down that way because it doesn't allow the reflection on the history. I thought the way the one in front of the Natural Museum was removed was properly handled. That was Theodore Roosevelt with a Native American and African American down, crouching, undignified, and he was
the other guy sort of doing the old Kimosabe, I see.
Right.
Buffalo on the horizon.
So you have this eugenicist on his horse with the two. Good. That statue should not be in a place where we marvel at its greatness. It belongs in a museum. People should not forget their history, as you said. So that was fine. It was done legally. The Pike statue was removed illegally, but nonetheless, it's gone. And I think that's a good thing, for not to have a Ku Klux Klansman at Judiciary Square in Washington. I think that's useful. But that's the music.
Okay. Beethoven's Seventh Symphony movement, second movement, Beethoven's Symphony, number 7. Again, we're just listening to an excerpt from Beethoven's Symphony Number 7, second movement, conducted by Wilhelm Furtwängler. We'll continue our interview with Diane Sare. I've got so many questions, and I know we're going to run out of time. So you'll have to come back again because we're really only halfway through my list. But I'm interested in your views on well, they're Larouche's, but they're also yours on a quote post-dollar world. Also, the ideas of trade without currency and the fixed exchange system.
Right. Well, as Larouche often said, money is an idiot. And people have to get through their head that money has no intrinsic value. And really, gold doesn't either, or silver. That's not the point. They became valuable because of the labor involved in extracting them. And frankly, gold and silver have also qualities that make them useful in various things. So there was a value ascribed to the dollar based on gold. But the point of that is that you'd like to know what your currency is going to be worth, not only today, but 10 and 25 years from now. If you're going to build in the United States, we desperately need a major transcontinental high-speed rail system. I have a colleague who's worked on this who thinks we need 43,000 miles of new high-speed rail. Probably that would take more than a couple of years to build, maybe 10 or 15 or 20 years. So if you're...
Unless, of course, you're China, you do it in 2 years flat.
Yeah, right. And you have 7 million people working on it simultaneously,
Exactly.
Completely synchronized, which is amazing. And now supposing this is in another country with a different currency, and so you take the loan, and you're going to be using pesos to repay the loan, and your currency is 10 to the dollar when you start the project, but at the end of the project it's 350 to the dollar, then suddenly you're going to owe 35 times what you borrowed, and then forget it. You're not going to plan anything that takes 25 years to build. So by allowing speculation on currencies, what you've now created is a situation where no one will ever do anything productive or farsighted again, because you simply can't do it. So the point of fixed exchange rates is to allow a certain stability. And it may be the case that as the world moves away from the dollar, a lot of people are saying it's going to be the yuan. It may not be the yuan. It may be more than one currency. Maybe it'll be a few currencies that become the currency of international arrangements and trade. Maybe they'll make up a totally new synthetic currency. I'm not sure. I do know that Sergei Glaziev, who is the top economist in Russia, and he's the head of the Eurasian Economic Union, for Lyndon LaRouche's 100th birth anniversary in 2022, he made a short video where he went as far as to say that the nations who are prospering, who are getting their economies under control, are nations where LaRouche played a major role. And that's, I mean, LaRouche and his wife traveled to, 40 plus nations, had a very strong friendship with Indira Gandhi, then Rajiv Gandhi. They have strong networks in India. Helga Zepp-LaRouche was in China in 1996, where she helped to actually organize a conference of 36 countries calling to revive the Silk Road. China didn't do it then. They got, hornswoggled or what by the Bush administration, and they did these stupid free trade zones, which didn't work.
But now they're back in action.
Exactly, in a big way. So what you see happening, which is working, why the sanctions aren't having their devastating impact, is that nations are getting away from this worship of money per se, and realizing that what really matters is the development of your human beings and the standard of living. The metric of economic success is a human-defined metric, not monetary.
Gosh. Such a revolutionary concept. No wonder he got locked up for it.
Yeah.
What are you trying to do? Solve all the problems of humanity? Speaking of optimism and music, and there's another piece called Through the Years.
Yeah, it's a play.
Oh, can we talk about that? And play
Yes,
that
and
bit.
the next piece, Through the Years, is a play that was written by Amelia Boynton Robinson. So people who are familiar with the Selma film, this was the woman who invited Martin Luther King to come to Selma, who led the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, who was herself beaten and left for dead on the bridge. And she wasn't that young then. She must have been, goodness, 60. Yeah, she was at least 60 years old at that time. She had been organizing with her parents for the right to vote since the 1920s and 30s. And in 1930, she wrote a play to raise money for a community center for the African American population. And the play was called Through the Years, and it had 21 Negro spirituals in it. And the play was about, and this is how Amelia was totally victorious. It was a flashback. It starts with an old man named Joshua on his deathbed, and he's telling his granddaughter about his life, which began as a slave on a plantation. I believe his mother was beaten to death. He escaped on the Underground Railroad. He became an officer in the Union Army. Then he became a congressman. Then he became a very successful businessman. And he bought the plantation on which he was born. And that was where he was living his last moments of his life. So the play takes you through all these scenes of his life. And given my musical background, this was done in DC. We performed it many times in 1994, 95, maybe 96 a little bit. So we had high school students acting the parts, and their parents and grandparents were in the chorus. And I directed the chorus, and I had the assistance of an amazing lady named Sylvia Olden Lee. She was the first African-American vocal coach ever hired at the Metropolitan Opera Company. She was the instigator to get Marian Anderson singing there. If you've ever seen, there's a PBS documentary called Baroque Duet. She was the coach of Kathleen Battle and Wynton Marsalis. And she came to my little choir rehearsals and worked with me on learning how to properly convey the intent of these spirituals.
Excellent. Wow. Okay. Well, that's great. Here we go. Well, Diane, we're going to run out of time, obviously, in the 2 hours with the pieces themselves. We're probably already at the 2 hour mark. But I wanted to go out with two things. First of all, I'd like to ask you directly, why should people vote for you?
Because they want to live a long, happy life.
Okay. Can't beat that idea. Well, I'll be voting for you for that, for sure. A long, happy life. And I guess also, where can people find you?
My website is sareforsenate.com, and my name is spelled S-A-R-E, only 4 letters, SAREFOR Senate.com. People can sign up to donate, to volunteer, to get on my email list. I'm also on Facebook and Twitter, rarely on TikTok, Telegram, and I just got a new phone and can't figure out how to get back into my Instagram account, so don't look for me there.
Okay. You don't have a content moderator? What's going on?
I had someone helping me with it, and maybe she can help me get it back.
Yeah,
but
content moderator, it's a full-time job. And on a positive note, I thought it would be excellent to go out with I'll tag on. We may not be able to play all 3 songs
Sure.
remaining, but I will include those in the sort of extras section of the show. But to go out with, I thought perhaps you could pick one of those 3. We've got Amen, Deep River.
I'd like to go out with the Amen from the Handel Messiah, just because I think it's completely glorious. It was the end of our concert program on the 15th anniversary of 9/11. The chorus I founded performed a concert of spirituals and the Mozart Requiem, directed by my colleague John Segerson. And at the end of the Mozart Requiem, we did the Amen from Handel's Messiah, which is a great, victorious work, and I thought it would be a beautiful way to end the program.
Well, Diane, thank you so much for sharing your time with us. And I look forward to having you back on the show sometime later in the year to check in on things and see how things are going with the campaign, and to learn a lot more about some of the amazing things that you're talking about. It's always interesting. I had the same experience with Bernie when I first heard him talking. I was like, there's someone to actually understand what they're saying. Like, it didn't just sound like gibberish,
Right.
Which is often what politicians, it just sounds like gibberish to me. It's like the Charlie Brown thing. Anyway, so thank you for bringing something into the discussion that's not gibberish.
Well, thank you. I love talking to. I love it when there's an interviewer with a mind on the other end. So it's really big fun.
Well, I don't know, a mind and some kind of weird Canadian sense of humor too to go with it. So, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
All right, thank you.
Talk
You
to you
too.
soon. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
And that concludes the interview I did actually just yesterday morning with Diane Sare, who is running for US Senate as a Larouche candidate. And just for clarification's sake, Diane Sare's website is www.sareforsenate.com, and there you can find all your information about Diane, about her campaign. You can donate and volunteer if you even wish. So, on with the show. As per Diane's request, thank you, Diane, so much. This is a piece entitled Amen. But perhaps this would be a good opportunity to play the rest of the Beethoven's Symphony Number 9 from where we kind of left off. So Dan, this is for you. We're going to the last 15 minutes or so of the show. So do enjoy, and I'll be back in about 15 minutes just to say goodnight.
Deinen Zauberwinden nieder, was die Mode sprengelt. Alle Menschen werden Frieden, wo dein sanfter Flügel feiert. Deinen Zauber
I'd like to say thanks once again to my guest, Diane Sare. Thank you, Diane, for being a wonderful guest on our show. Thank you to Liz Hill, my producer. Thank you, Liz. And if the good Lord's willing and the creek don't rise, we'll see you next week for more good times. And let's all think together about the idea of peace, not just for Ukraine, but for the rest of the world too. As John and Yoko said, war's over if you want it. You have to want it first. Good night.